This is Bezrat Hashem, our final meeting on the unit, does the Torah determine what morality is, or do we, religious belief versus human responsibility? And just to recap very briefly, we noted multiple strata here. That is, we first discussed the aspect that we really do deem to be a social and rational imperative, but that's precisely the Noachide covenant, and it's as distinct from the Torah. And the critical dimension that we discussed at length, and we kept on discussing since, is the difference between a system of morality that is autonomous and one that is heteronomous. Autonomous meaning it can be generated from within. Heteronomous means we need to receive it from outside. In as much as we do find in our tradition the notion of being able to, in some sense, intuit the Noachide laws, hachra'at hadat, determination of the mind, then we regard that system as, in principle, an autonomous one. That doesn't mean that one cannot subscribe to it as a God-given commandment, but it is possible to subscribe to the Noachide covenant as an autonomous system, whereas with respect to Torah, we have no such concept. That is, the Torah, if not received, will not be known. And even to the extent that we speak of the patriarchs as having had a connection with the Torah before it was given, whether that's to be understood literally or not is, of course, a question in and of itself. The implication of them having access to the Torah before it was given is not that they intuited it, but rather that through some mechanism they were able to access it. Meaning, as in the case of Avraham, that his innards became well springs and Torah welled up through them. In other words, it was a gift. It was something that came to him, not something that he intuited on his own. There's no concept of being able to intuit the Torah, even at the level of Abraham, much less, of course, all of the rest of us. Torah is something that one needs to receive. And it was in that vein, then, that we have heretofore discussed 3.5 different perspectives with respect to Torah, which are not intended to exclude one another, but rather to complement one another. The first was the inevitable corollary of recognizing that it is specifically the Noachide covenant that is the autonomous system as opposed to the Torah, and that is the inscrutable authoritarian imperative. The Torah is chok, as something that we accept as a decree, but really have no way of accessing beyond that. The next stratum was the realization that, of course, there is an aspect of a moral code in the Torah, both interpersonal mitzvot and others, interpersonal mitzvot and beyond the Torah as a divinely ordained moral code. The third stratum, going beyond that, a change from within the Torah as a generator of inner moral growth. In other words, beyond the extent to which the Torah itself legislates moral law, it serves as the impetus, the generator for us to develop a higher level of morality internally. And I remind you, we already noted why it is personally important for me to enunciate these various strata. That is, that in particular, in theories of moral development that developed, say, roughly a half century ago or so, the idea that one subscribes to a system of morality by dint of religious belief was deemed inferior to coming up with a system of morality on one's own. And on some intuitive plane, we appreciate that. That is, the idea that a moral system needs to be heteronomous, it needs to be received as opposed to cultivated from within, we appreciate has its deficiencies. That is, you haven't really become, in some sense, that moral being because you need to receive the dictates from outside. So, of course, the moment that we appreciate that beyond that aspect of the Torah itself as the divinely ordained moral code, in other words, that the Torah is legislating morality, when it is a generator of inner moral growth, then on some plane, that level of inner moral growth going beyond the actual legislation of the moral code that we find in the Torah implies something of an autonomous system. So there is a dimension of coming to a system of morality that is, if you will, more exalted than our merely accepting a set of imperatives that legislate to us morality. And yet, that still was not, of course, the final high note of this crescendo. It was on that score that we began last time discussing our final subunit, and that is beyond mere morality, the Torah as the guide to transcendent godliness. And what, as we noted, underlies this final unit is, in some sense, the realization that while there is undoubtedly significance, worthiness, merit in discussing the mechanisms through which man becomes a moral being. And obviously, current events drive that point home with relentless force. It is possible for man to be the most horrific monster imaginable. So a human being functioning as a moral being is certainly nothing with which to trifle. And yet simultaneously, a human being being a moral being is not, from the perspective of the Torah, the be-all and end-all of our spiritual growth and development. There is such a thing as, try to define this somewhat more rigorously, being godly, beyond being merely moral. And of course, it was in that vein that we began our discussion of this unit last time. And we focused in particular on the various commentators on the Mishnah of Rabban Gamliel beno shel Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Again, aseh ritzono kiritzonecha kedei sheyaseh ritzonecha kiritzono, to, depending upon the translation, do his will as your will, so that he will do your will as his will, or perhaps more aptly, in particular, given our discussion last time, make his will to be as your will, so that he will make your will as to be his will. Of course, we appreciate that the verb la'asot in Hebrew can be understood as both doing and making. And it is in the latter sense that we consider the implication, as we saw it enunciated by a huge gamut of commentators from among the earliest on Pirkei Avot, that this Mishnah should certainly not be understood on a facile level of some instrumental reciprocity. You do for me, I'll do for you, but rather on the contrary, on the sublime level of a transformation of our will into becoming godly will. And then, of course, inevitably, God makes your will his will, because your will has become his will. You will the divine will. And likewise, the second clause of the statement to annul, negate your will before his will, so that he will negate the will of others before your will. Again, understanding that as the negation of those aspects of will that contravene divine will. So it's certainly not a matter of we want to get the goods, so to speak, so we obey, but rather that we transform that which we are seeking, that which we will. And of course, manifestly, that's precisely what we're discussing in terms of the attainment of transcendent godliness. You make your will into divine will, you become a more godly being. So again, this is something that we discussed at length over the course of our last meeting. We noted as a kind of, if you will, postscript on that, the comment of Rambam in Hilchot Gerushin, that under those circumstances in which the court deems the recalcitrant husband obligated to give his wife a bill of divorce, if he refuses, we beat him. And the halachic prescription here is a beating that knows no limit until the husband says, I want to give her the bill of divorce. And if he never says that, then, as we noted last week, the prescription in halacha under such circumstances is you beat him until she doesn't need a bill of divorce because she's been widowed. Now, we certainly don't want it to come to that. We want him to say, I want to give her the bill of divorce. And of course, inevitably the question, to what extent is this really his will if he's being beaten up until he says, I want to? And what Rambam presents as the perspective on this procedure is we are, as it were, beating out of him that yetzer hara, that drive towards evil, that is really an alien overlay on his innermost desire, which is to be consonant with God's will. In other words, ultimately, the imperative that Rabban Gamliel, Beno Shel Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, enunciated to transform your will into being the will of God. So on some native plane, if you will, apropos of the words of Ecclesiastes, that God made man upright. They have sought many contrivances. So to the extent that one's native condition is upright as consequent to divine creation, so we just have to return to that native state of being upright and not seeking devices. And that's something that, again, transcends merely the question of morality, because it pertains ultimately to the gamut of how I make my will consonant with God. Now, this inevitably precipitates a consideration of what it means to be godly. And as I noted at the conclusion last time, I'd like to do something of a brief survey of what that means in three of the premier expositors of Torah in the early rabbinical period, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Rambam, and Ramban. Well, it won't be exactly in that order, as we shall see. We'll consider Rambam and then Ramban, and then only at the end we'll get to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Ultimately, as we shall see, they're all discussing the Torah as that vehicle to the attainment of transcendent godliness. Just inevitably, we'll need to define more rigorously what being godly means for each of these three. Obviously, there is much in common, but there can also be nuances of distinction. So let's begin our discussion with Rambam, and in particular focus upon the extent to which Rambam is presenting to us clearly a notion of godliness that subsumes within it, and yet goes beyond mere morality. The first source that we note here, we'll note each of these sources, unfortunately, only in brief, because rigorously studying even one of them would take more time than we've got, let alone studying them all. In the 7th chapter of Rambam's 8-chapter introduction to Ethics of the Fathers, the Shmona Prakim, he considers the prerequisites of prophecy. The prerequisites of prophecy in the manner that they are presented in the Gemara. That is, the Gemara speaks, to be precise, of 4 prerequisites, although 3 are invariant. The 4th appears in 2 different manners in the 2 sources in the Gemara that explicitly discuss this. The Gemara in Tractate Shabbat, page 92a, and the Gemara in Tractate Nedarim, page 38a. The 3 that are invariant are a threesome that is very familiar from various other contexts. Perhaps first, Yirmiyahu, chapter 9, the last 2 verses that we read in the Haftarah of Shacharit on Tisha B'Av, where we speak of the wise not exulting in his wisdom, nor the mighty in his might, nor the wealthy in his wealth. And curiously, those 3, wise, mighty, and wealthy, are all prerequisites for prophecy. And how does Rambam understand these 3? It's a fascinating question to consider what underlies Rambam's interpretation. Not everyone agrees with Rambam on this score, but on the one hand, he understands wise in the most basic literal sense. That is, no prophet can prophesy before having attained all intellectual virtues. He needs to have attained that level of, if you will, intellectual self-actualization. And moreover, most character virtues, and the important among them. Note the contrast here. All intellectual virtues, most character virtues. And how does he see this enunciated in the Talmudic list of prerequisites of prophecy? Very simply, chacham, he understands literally. One needs to be wise. And as for mighty and wealthy, he bids us consider the meanings of those 2 adjectives in the Mishnah of Ben Zoma at the beginning of the 4th chapter of Ethics of the Fathers, that the Gibor, the mighty one, is the one who is Kovesh et Yitzro, who conquers his passions, his inclinations, and the one who is wealthy is the one who is happy in his share, in his portion. And both of those, of course, signify character virtues. So it's interesting, of course, that Rambam understands wise in a literal sense, whereas he understands the other 2 in this, if you will, metaphorical or borrowed sense. Bottom line, however, is that the character virtue, one could well argue, constitutes a code of morality. And it's important, but it's not enough. Moreover, it isn't even that which signifies preeminent importance, because with respect to character virtue, the prophet needs to have refined himself in his character to have attained most character virtue. But with respect to intellect, all intellectual virtue. And while Rambam's Mishnah commentary is the first major work that he produced in the chronology of his literary enterprises, God of the Perplexed is arguably the last major work, and we consider in complementarity with that source from the Mishnah, from the introduction to the commentary on Ethics of the Fathers, the very last chapter of God of the Perplexed. The very last chapter of God of the Perplexed, Rambam presents to us the concept of 4 levels of completeness. That is, that which could be construed to constitute completeness from a human perspective. And to go through the list in brief, he makes very short shrift of the first 2, stressing that they really have nothing to do with the essence of the person. The first is completeness in acquisition, material wealth. The second is completeness in body, that is, physical strength, health, completeness on a bodily plane. And ultimately, Rambam regards neither of them as pertaining to the essence of what a human being is. What's relevant for our purposes is a consideration of the 3rd and 4th levels of completeness. The 3rd is completeness in character, what we would describe as moral virtue. Note, it's 3rd, it's not 4th. And Rambam emphasizes, with respect to this one as well, that it isn't the final goal. What we will stress, in contrast to the manner in which he deals with the first 2, is that this completeness of character with respect to moral virtue does have a crucial role to play as prerequisite of the 4th and final level of completeness. The 4th and final level of completeness, as you might well have anticipated, and certainly consistent with what we saw in the introduction to Avot, is as described, the true human completeness, which is the attainment of intellectual virtue. That, from Rambam's perspective, is the culmination. The culmination, of course, that is manifest most critically in, as he goes on to say, the very next line, to be able to apprehend intellectual matters and to learn through them theological verities, ultimately to apply one's intellect to connecting with God. That, from Rambam's perspective, of course, is the epitome of godliness. Not at all incidentally. That's the final chapter of the guide. The first chapter of the guide is where Rambam introduces the terms tselem and dimut that are used to describe that with which God endows man by virtue of the manner in which God creates man. Tselem, usually translated as image, for Rambam would better be translated as essence, and demut, translated as likeness, is likeness to the essence. And what's the essence? The essence, Rambam tells us, is the intellect, sechel. Because again, there also, when we consider what that is that serves as the bridge between man and God, it is the intellect. What is it that enables man to come to God? That is the intellect. So ultimately, what signifies godliness in man? Most of all, the intellect. We aren't belittling morality. Morality has a role, but it's a subordinate role. It's a role of ultimately contributing to, providing the undergirding for that attainment of intellectual virtue. This is something that Rambam also enunciates in the first unit of the guide in chapter 32, that the lack of moral refinement is an impediment to the attainment of intellectual virtue, intellectual completeness. But again, we reiterate, morality is important, but morality is subordinate to that utmost level of godliness that for Rambam is intellectual. Now, again, we'll note, that's Rambam. His is not the only voice in this discussion. We now go on to consider Ramban. Ramban addresses this issue on a number of planes and in a number of contexts in his Torah commentary and other works. We'll just cite here from the Torah commentary. Our time is limited. In noting first, in particular, the verses in Parashat Ekev, Deuteronomy chapter 10, what is God asking of you? And what seems ironic in context is that the answer to this ostensibly rhetorical question is really rather awesome. That is, what is God asking of you? Merely to revere God your Lord, to go in all of his ways, to love him, to serve God your Lord with all of your heart, with all of your soul, to keep the commandments of God and his statutes that I am commanding you this day. Seems like quite a massive list, doesn't it? Yes, but there's another two words here. L'tov lach, for your own good. Everything that God is asking of you, he's asking only for your own good. Comments Ramban. With respect to the question, indeed, it is all drawn toward that two-word conclusion. It is for your own good, because ultimately, none of the commandments provides any service to God. God has no needs. His bidding us to live a life that is consonant with what he reveals in the Torah is all tov lach, for your own good. And ultimately, of course, we need to ask ourselves, so what is that good? What is that good of being transformed by the mitzvot? Perhaps a more apt answer we can glean from what is arguably the most famous comment of Ramban in his Torah commentary. And this is Ramban in Parashat Kedoshim, the first comment of Ramban in Parashat Kedoshim, in Leviticus chapter 19, where we read the imperative of Kedoshim Tihu, to be holy. And consider, what is this imperative to be holy? So as Ramban notes, the formulation that we read in the Midrash Halacha, the Sifra on this verse, is Kedoshim Tihu, Perushim Tihu, to separate yourselves from what we could broadly describe as this worldly distractions. And what is, of course, so famously enunciated by Ramban in his commentary, in which he cites the Sifrei, is, you can obey the gamut of all of the quantified mitzvot, the quantified commandments of the Torah, and you can still be an abomination. The term that Ramban famously coins here is a naval birshut haTorah, a disgusting person with the Torah's license, because such an individual is keeping all of the laws, the way Ramban details the presentation, in as much as it's possible for a man to enjoy a sensual life with his wife to utter extremes, and to engage in ceaseless gluttony, and spend his time eating meat, drinking wine, and moreover to pollute his mouth with all manner of obscenity, which after all isn't in any way explicitly forbidden in the Torah. So for such an individual, and ultimately for all of us, the Torah gives us this two-word imperative, Kedoshim Tihu. And what is critically added by these two words? Well, maybe the first question to ask is, so this imperative, Kedoshim to you, can we quantify it? Can we tack it down at the corners and say this is exactly what it entails? And ultimately, Ramban's answer to this question is the significance of this mitzvah is precisely because it defies being quantified. That is, we have all these other mitzvot that are indeed quantified. They represent point-wise imperatives or prohibitions. And to the extent that they are point-wise imperatives or prohibitions, what do they lack? Necessarily, what they lack is engendering an orientation. If I may employ a mathematical analogy, you plot points on coordinate axes. You don't have a curve. So you can't take the derivative. You can't get some kind of a sense of where matters are heading. You need that generalization that defies being quantified, that tells you where you need to aim to go. So you have all of these rigorously quantified mitzvot. And of course, they're crucial, because if you wouldn't have any quantified mitzvot at all, then in the worst way possible, even beyond the abomination with Torah's license, everything goes. But it's not enough to give you this exhaustive list of imperatives and prohibitions, because, all of the imperatives and prohibitions considered in aggregate give you a zone that we could describe as the white imperatives and the black prohibitions. And then there's this vast terrain in the middle that is gray, that is neither an imperative nor a prohibition. What are you supposed to do there? You could say, well, it's not black, anything goes. Someone could come in and propose the opposite, that since it's not a categorical imperative, one should refrain from doing it. But ultimately, in the absence of Kedoshim to you, you have no guidance. And Kedoshim to you, be holy, is telling you, okay, in general, beyond that which is quantified on the margins, you should be striving to imbue your life with holiness. And what is holiness? So again, we already noted. The Midrash says, Perushim, separated. Separated means what? It doesn't mean a categorically ascetic life in which one eschews any this worldly pleasure, but it does presume the realization that one is in this world not merely to have a good time, that there needs to be some ongoing, relentless quest for meaning, under which everything in life will ultimately be subsumed. Now, that's a quest for godliness, because ultimately, when we recall the manner in which the Torah expressed this imperative, it is Kedoshim to you, ki kadosh, ani Hashem. You be holy because I'm holy. Now, obviously, we aren't coming up with some kind of facile recipe for understanding what God is or what it means to be godly. But there is the realization that we need to strive to a level of holiness that goes beyond that which can be quantified. Now, I'll note, we actually saw and discussed on some plane a similar sort of notion in Ramban's commentary when we considered the Torah as a divinely ordained moral code that is in Parashat Ve'etchanan, Deuteronomy chapter 6, where we read the Torah's imperative, Ve'asita hayashav ve'atov be'enei Hashem. You shall do that which is upright and good in the sight of God. And there too, Ramban essentially emphasized the same idea, that we have the whole gamut of laws that pertain to not wronging one's fellow man, and not cheating, not stealing, not engaging in any of the repugnant behaviors that are manifestly immoral. And while we have all these, again, quantified, specific rules, the Torah gives you this general statement to do that which is upright and good, because it's not enough merely to obey the quantified imperatives. And there too, Ramban essentially enunciated the same principle, that if you are only obeying the quantified imperatives, you can still be a really awful person. And not at all incidentally, the idea that is expressed by Rashi, of course, based upon what the sages tell us, is that Hayashar v'hatov, that which is upright and good, represents going lifni mishurat adin. Now, we've noted the proper translation of lifni mishurat adin in the past. Usually it's translated as going beyond the letter of the law, which manifestly is the antithesis of what lifnim literally means. Lifnim means within. It doesn't mean going beyond, because beyond is out of bounds. Within means to have indeed so thoroughly internalized a sense of right and wrong that one doesn't merely conform to the letter of the law, but its spirit on a level that essentially is reading between the lines. That's Vasid Hayashav Atov. And in much the same vein, then when we consider the imperative of Koshim to you, it likewise demands of us the same sort of fidelity to God's will beyond that which can be quantified. In other words, again, essentially becoming godly. Now we'll note an additional dimension here, and this is Ramban on Shiluach HaKen, on sending away the mother bird before taking the young. Without expanding upon this at too great length, because I realize our time is very limited, Rambam in Guide of the Perplexed, in the third unit of the guide, in chapter 48, when he discusses this mitzvah within the context of the explication of ta'amei mitzvot, reasons or tastes of the commandments generally, addresses the implications of this mitzvah. Rambam says that it is as means for protecting even the bird from the anguish of being present and seeing its young being taken. And Ramban dissents. Ramban notes, first in context, we certainly subscribe to the idea that the mitzvot have reasons. Again, I'm synopsizing very briefly. Ramban, in this vein, further elaborates upon the implications of the midrash that Ramban cites from the Tanchuma. The midrash reads, what difference does it make, the Holy One, blessed be He, whether one slaughters an animal and eats it, or clobbers it and eats it? Are you bestowing any benefit upon God or harming God? Or what difference does it make to God whether one eats permitted flesh or one eats animals that died through means other than proper slaughter? And ultimately, the response in the Midrash is Lo nitnu hamitzvot ela letzaref bahen et habriot, that the commandments were given to us in order to refine humanity through them. And the manner in which Ramban understands this is that, again, apropos of what we saw in his commentary on Litov Lach, for your own good, the mitzvot aren't intended to bestow any benefit, of course, upon the giver of the commandments, but rather on us, for us to be refined through them. Now, at this stage, one could enunciate a conception of the mitzvah as indeed engendering some moral sensitivity. Says Ramban that refinement is that you shouldn't be a cruel person. So even when it comes to the mother bird, send away the mother bird so you won't become inured to acts of cruelty that you may then bestow on your fellow man. I'll note here, first, a crucial distinction between the manner in which Ramban understands the thrust of this midrash and the manner in which Rambam does. That is, Rambam cites this midrash in the third unit of the guide, in chapter 26, where he understands it without getting into the ins and outs of why he understands it this way. He understands it as implying that we should look for reasons for the generality of the mitzvah, but not for the subtleties of the fulfillment of the mitzvah, where when one considers why Rambam draws that distinction, and moreover states that in his esteem, someone who seeks reasons for all the subtleties of the mitzvah is as far from the truth as one who doesn't seek reasons for the generality of the mitzvah. We appreciate that what underlies Rambam's perspective is his cognizance that there are other approaches to understanding the mitzvot that are not predicated upon seeking reasons that resonate with the intellect. There can be other levels of reasons, we'll consider this shortly, levels that are more esoteric, levels that, from Rambam's perspective, are really totally off the radar screen. So Rambam says, if you're not looking for mitzvot for the generality of the mitzvah, reasons for the generality of the mitzvah, if you are rather just doing the mitzvah as something that engages your body but doesn't engage your mind, you're missing the point. But if you're seeking reasons for subtleties of the mitzvah, and those subtleties are then explained to you on a plane that does not conform to intellect, but rather esoteric reasons, you're also off the screen. You're someplace out in left field, but you're not looking for the reasons that, from Rambam's perspective, we should be seeking in human cognition in the intellect. Ramban, on the other hand, doesn't feel any compunction about those esoteric reasons. Rather, in fact, on the contrary, without, again, elaborating upon everything that Ramban says in his rather extensive commentary on this mitzvah, after he speaks of the goal of the mitzvot being to sensitize us so that we don't become cruel, he concludes by citing an esoteric work, an early esoteric work, Sefer HaBahir, also known in the parlance of Ramban as the Midrash of Rabbi Yechonia ben Hakaneh, on this mitzvah of sending away the mother bird. And as Ramban notes, we're not going to go into the esoterics, but he states, Midrash yesh b'mitzvah sod. Midrash says that there's an esoteric dimension in this mitzvah. And it has implications with respect to what one has in mind when one sends away the mother bird. It has to do with the sfirot. For those who are familiar, we're not going to get into the details now, but it's a completely esoteric plane of relating to the mitzvah, and that, from Ramban's perspective, ultimately is really the message of this mitzvah, sending away the mother bird. In other words, what Ramban tacitly, maybe more than tacitly, is telling you is the mitzvot are indeed intended to transform you, not merely on the intellectual level to which Rambam directs us, but rather on an esoteric plane, if you will, the human soul, on a level that transcends the bounds of the intellect. And that's precisely why this mitzvah of sending away the mother bird is of such significance. It is in much this vein that Ramban, returning to his commentary on Parashat Kedoshim, on Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19, where the Torah introduces the prohibitions on mixing species, and so on, the prohibition on interbreeding. The thrust of Ramban's comment is that while these mitzvot unequivocally fall into the category of the chok, the inscrutable, that's not to imply there isn't any reason for them. It's rather to appreciate that the reason is something that is beyond our comprehension. He focuses in particular on the prohibition of shatnez, the intermixing of wool and linen. And while it is particularly in that domain that Ramban sees an example of a mitzvah that has a completely elusive reason, he emphasizes that's not to imply that there is no reason. Rather, on the contrary, there are reasons that are known in the realm of the divine that the king doesn't reveal to his subjects. And people don't know what the benefit is. And as a result, they belittle these mitzvot. And so too, the chukim of the Holy One, blessed be He, are, as Ramban expresses it, sodot asher lo b'Torah, his secrets in the Torah. And the implication then of the secret is that there's some kind of esoteric transformation that takes place that you're not going to understand. It's not going to operate on the level of the intellect. There's something far more sublime that can be described as godliness that pertains to the mitzvah, and the transformation pertains to that godliness. And that is, again, the extent that morality, we understand. That's something that is apprehensible to the intellect. This is something more. Far more. When Rambam speaks about the completeness of the intellect, he also means something that goes beyond character virtues, beyond morality. But when Ramban speaks about this level of completeness, he means something that goes beyond the intellect entirely. And it is likewise in this vein that Ramban, in his commentary on Parashat Ve'etchanan, in considering what the Torah tells us, that through the mitzvot, there is this universal acclaim that when the nations will hear about these chukim again, are the inscrutable statutes, they will say, this great nation is exclusively one that is wise and sagacious. And what ultimately does that mean? States Ramban, that on some plane, we will indeed be able to apprehend in these chukim a level that is godly, even as it is transcendent. Yes, they will have benefits that may even be readily apparent, but there are additional dimensions that pertain to the chukim. They indeed exert this transformative impact on those who obey them, such that our enemies will praise us for our fidelity to the chukim as well. So again, a level of godliness. How do we quantify it? We don't. It's not just intellect. It's even beyond the intellect. But there's something then that goes beyond what we would describe as human morality, and even what we describe as human intellect. And ultimately, the mitzvot cohere with that. And this brings us to our final note in this discussion, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in Sefer Kuzari. And it is in particular noteworthy in this regard to appreciate the extent to which, undoubtedly, not only far more than Rambam, but far more than Ramban, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi at least as an ideal, eschews a preoccupation with reasons for the mitzvot. This is an idea that is enunciated throughout the work. In the first treatise of Sefer Kuzari, at the end of section 99, the emphasis that in service of God there is no room for reasoning nor intellectualizing. That's the approach rather of the philosophers, referring to the Greek philosophers. And if that would really work, then they would have attained a far higher level than that which was attained by Israel in its Torah. And to further amplify this point, and also note the implications with respect to the verses in Parashat Ekev, Deuteronomy chapter 10, upon which Ramban was commenting, in the second treatise of Sefer Kuzari, there is an exchange. Of course, the whole format of the work is dialogue format, an exchange between the Khazar king and his Jewish mentor regarding the extent to which there is any need for adherence to anything other than the essential, if you will, moral imperatives of the Torah. And the king, in defense of his argument that there is no such additional need, indeed cites the words of Deuteronomy chapter 10, what does God ask of you other than that you revere him? Of course, we already noted that's not the end of the verse. There's a lot more that God expects, but that's besides the point. He also notes in Teralia, the very well-known verse from Micha chapter 6, that God has told you, O man, what is good and what God demands of you, rather only to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. How many humanistic sermons have begun and ended with that verse? So how do we relate to that verse and its implications? And to summarize in very great brevity, the profound message that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi conveys in his commentary and his response to the king's question, what these statements and others like them enunciate is the most basic threshold of being a human being. And in the time of Micha, by way of example, one sees clearly that Israel was so derelict in its fulfillment of its obligations that so far as the prophet was concerned, in essence, God says, if you just be human, that would already be good, because you're not even functioning as human beings. The most basic standards of equitable interpersonal conduct are what characterize human society on its most basic plane of existence. If you're not there, you're not anywhere. And kindly don't, as enunciated by the prophets repeatedly, bring sacrifices and engage in all sorts of transcendent spiritual acts, as it were, when you aren't even functioning as a human being. The way I like to illustrate this point, I apologize if this might sound a little bit irreverent, is, so if you put tefillin on a monkey, have you sanctified the monkey? Answer, of course, no, you have desecrated the tefillin. You need to be a human being before you can put on tefillin. The implications of tefillin ultimately encompass something that goes beyond only being a human being. Mitzvot that pertain to a kind of resonance with a divine essence that goes beyond, if you will, the intellectual essence that characterizes the human condition. But if you're not functioning as a human being, then forget about all those other mitzvot. The crucial bottom line that emerges from this, and this is indeed enunciated by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the second treatise of Sefer Kuzari in section 48, and perhaps even more so in the third treatise of Sefer Kuzari in section 7, is there are those mitzvot that resonate with the social rational imperative. Recall the dichotomy drawn by the Gemara and the Midrash between the chok and the mishpat. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi recasts that in terms of the dichotomy between, well, instead of mishpat, we'll speak of the ma'asim yiduim, the known deeds that conform to hama'asim haminhagiyim v'achukim hasichliyim, social and rational imperatives. And what characterizes them? What characterizes them is not comprehensibility versus their being elusive or incomprehensible. What characterizes them is that they resonate with us as beings endowed with an intellect. They resonate with our intellectual essence. And that's, of course, something significant. The intellectual essence is what characterizes most essentially the human condition. And yet, there are mitzvot that are intended not to resonate with that intellectual essence, but with something more. The divine essence with which we are endowed as the nation that receives the Torah from God. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi makes this point with utmost force in the third treatise, in section 7, these divine acts, as opposed to the social and rational imperatives, these divine acts, which are additional to the others, and are the basis of this divine essence being in the midst of the nation of the living God, for the sake of which God guides us, aren't known in the sense of something that is coherent with our intellects. We just receive them from God. Now, it's ironic that, considering that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is on some plane commenting on the essential dichotomy that we note in the Talmud between the chok and the mishpat, the inscrutable imperative and the judgment with which our minds resonate, that he isn't focusing upon the incomprehensibility of this latter category of divine deeds. And perhaps the most obvious illustration of that realization is the first example that he uses for the divine deed is the covenant of circumcision. We already know Rabbi Yehuda Halevi doesn't make much of ta'amei mitzvot, reasons for mitzvot. One of the only mitzvot in which he does provide some sense of ta'amei mitzvot, reasons, ironically, is that one, circumcision. First treatise of Sefer Kuzari in section 115. So why does he use that as his premier example here? Because it's not about incomprehensibility. It's about establishing a covenant with God. It's about cohering with the divine. It's about, again, transcendent godliness. And that transcendent godliness is something that is engendered through the mitzvot and not through those that signify the social and rational imperatives, which of course subsume within them all laws that we will describe as moral imperatives. Rather, it's precisely the divine acts that establish within us some extraordinary resonance with the divine. And it is precisely in this vein that he relentlessly emphasizes that this isn't something with which our minds are resonating. It's not because incomprehensibility is of foundational importance here. It's not. Just again, as he expresses it in the third treatise in section 23, when it comes to the Torah, it isn't through our reasoning that we get to Ritzon HaElokim, to divine will, to divine favor. Rather, the only route to God is through the commandments of God themselves, as ordained by God, and not as reflective of our understanding of them or of the manner in which they are to be performed and the measure through which we are to fulfill them. It's all about ultimately being adherent to the divine essence, that level that takes us beyond the human intellect. And perhaps by way of conclusion, we'll just note, this is really our final source. There's so much to comment further on this, but the encapsulation will suffice for now. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, in the third treatise of Sefer Kuzari, in section 53, gives us a really dramatic illustration of how mitzvot have their operation. And truth be told, the analogy that he uses is how a baby is conceived. The partners engaging in that conception don't necessarily have to understand how the consequence of their act will be a new life coming into this world. The deed itself has dynamism of its own. It is the action that is preeminent and transformative. And so too, he tells us, giving a very vivid description of how one brings a sacrificial offering. He describes how, by way of example, you slaughter the lamb and become filthy with all of the blood and gore and the flaying of the skin and washing out the innards and rinsing them and cutting them up and casting the blood and arranging the wood pile and lighting the fire. And he goes on to emphasize, and were all of this not by dint of divine command, you would disdain these actions and think that if anything, they distance you from God rather than bring you close. In other words, this is not something with which you are cohering through your intellect, because if anything, your intellect responds to these actions with a resounding yech. And yet, if you completed the deed as you were commanded, and you now see a heavenly fire, or you find within yourself a new spirit to which you were unaccustomed, or true dreams or wondrous signs were beheld by you, you will immediately know that these are all consequent to that which you have done and the great matter to which you have become adherent and that you have thereby reached. In other words, now you might think that all these consequences are simply a result of the mental state that you take going into the act. Says Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the opposite is the case, because the mental state, again, is that resounding yech. With respect to the heavenly fire, the fire coming down from heaven, well, I'm prepared to say it's like following a recipe. If you want the cake to come out right, you better follow the instructions or else the recipe fails. Yeah, but when you find within yourself a new spirit to which you were unaccustomed, you experience true revealing dreams or wondrous signs, you have been transformed. You're a new person, and you're a new person because of the deed. Now, ultimately, you'll note that what these three authors, of course, have in common is to focus upon the deed. Inevitably, it is through the framework of mitzvot that we strive to be transformed and to come to God. For Rambam, the central significance of the deed, of the mitzvah, is the cognition that we associate with it, which is why, indeed, the last major unit in the guide, the second half of Unit 3 pertains to Ta'amei Mitzvot, reasons for the commandments. Because if you just come to the commandment with your limbs, with your extremities, but you haven't engaged your intellect, then you may have fulfilled your obligation, but the essence of what you are has been left out in the cold. For Ramban, again, there's a focus upon deed, and that focus upon deed, as we've seen, is, if anything, in a sense, the antithesis of what Rambam stated, because it's not a matter of the intellect, it's a matter of something esoteric that really cannot be quantified. And for Rabbi Yehuda Levi, even more resoundingly, a stress upon the deed qua deed, which is going to transform you and make you into a godly being, engaged in an intimate bond with God. Now, where does that leave us with respect to that original title question? Does the Torah determine what morality is, or do we? Religious belief versus human responsibility. Morality, indeed, we can categorize on these various planes that we've already discussed. That is, the extent to which the Torah is simply that inscrutable authoritarian imperative, the chok, the extent to which the Torah is indeed a divinely ordained moral code, and the extent to which the Torah, beyond being a moral code, generates inner moral growth. But at the end of the day, if we don't appreciate that, as we noted way back, Torah and morality are two distinct sets. There's an overlap between them, but never an identity. Because the ultimate goal of Torah is not just to make man moral. That's important. If you're not there, again, apropos of what Rabbi Yehuda told us, you're not human. There's nothing to talk about. But simultaneously, if you've only done that, then you're only human. And that's not the goal either. The goal, indeed, is transcendent godliness. A human being comes into this world, as we've noted on many occasions, as a completely physical being endowed with spiritual potential. And all of life is about striving to actualize that potential. There are those who seize upon that opportunity to utterly debase themselves and instead become monsters. There are those who merely live life as animals. They don't become monsters, but they never actualize spiritual potential. And there are those who seize upon the opportunity to actualize themselves as moral human beings. And while we will certainly spurn the first category and even disdain the second, and while on some plane we will laud the third, because someone who is behaving morally for life is at the very least not category 1 and not category 2, and thus not an abomination and not a criminal. There still is more to life than merely being moral. It's not to imply that morality ever flies out the window or ever becomes irrelevant or accessory, but it's not the utmost goal. There's a goal of becoming godly, under which being moral will be subsumed, but being moral will also be transcended. Again, that never will excuse being immoral or even being amoral. It's merely recognizing that even being moral is not the end of the game. There's a goal to becoming godly. And that ultimately is the culmination of this progression.